Good evening. It's actually Chodesh Tov, as we say in Hebrew. We start a new month of Nisan, the first month of the year. The first mitzvah of the Torah is to start counting months from today, as of tonight, basically. So we're literally holding at the beginning, at the new beginning. And I also want to dedicate this session, this study with you, to Refuah Shlema, to speedy recovery of everybody around the world. All the people are suffering now. Unfortunately, we're in the middle of big crisis, and of course our thoughts are with all those who are choleh, who are not feeling well right now. May they all have Refuah Shlema. And also, I think our very, very special thanks should go to all the medical practitioners, all the people around the world who really doing so much to, to make it all these thousands and thousands of people around the world who are crowded in hospitals, and they literally fighting this battle, and we of course wish them success. Our sages, Chazal, are telling us that every human life, every human being is the whole world. So they are saving worlds right now. And I really hope that the best we can do is be part of the solution, not be part of the problem, as we say, right? So hopefully by staying home and not spreading it out, that's already good enough that we do. And hopefully if we can use this time productively and study Torah, that's what we're doing now. Thank God to the technology that allows us to do this. We're having Zoom, we're having Skype, we're having all those beautiful instruments to connect, even though we cannot physically be connected right now. We are in isolation, but we can connect virtually, and that's a great thing. So, l'chaim for that one. That's actually just hot water with honey and lemon, right? We're still in winter somehow, but anyhow. Our session tonight is going to be an introduction to, as we said, it's a new month. It's a beginning of a Hebrew calendar. It's also very symbolic. We start a new Sefer, a new book in the Torah. We start Vayikra. Sefer Vayikra, the third book of Torah, which is known otherwise as Leviticus, because of, or like in Hebrew tradition in the Talmud, Torat Kohanim, because it has all the sacrificial order, all the laws related to the temple service. And of course the big question is how all of this is relevant to us today. You may be surprised, but this is the first book they study in the Talmud Torah. The little kids, when they start learning Torah, usually start from Vayikra. So it's another beginning. Usually little kids have been introduced to the Torah from these very challenging passages of the book that doesn't even seem to be necessarily relevant to us today. Not very clear how it is. So hopefully what we try to accomplish tonight, I call this lecture Sacrifices and Self. Sacrifices and Self. We try to understand how this is relevant to us today, the 21st century. We live without a temple for almost 2,000 years, and yet we study Torah on a weekly basis. We have Parshat Shavua, we have the Torah portion, and it's relevant, it's important. So we need to understand how all of this is working in our life today. And I'd like to start with a quote from one of my favorite rabbis. That's former chief rabbi of United Hebrew Congregations, that's Rabbi Lord Sachs. He wrote the following, and you'd be surprised the topic seems to be not necessarily related to sacrifices at all. He's talking about happiness and meaning. Happiness and meaning, but we're going to see that this concept that he introduces will help us to unlock the understanding of what are we to learn from the korbanot, from the sacrifices. So he says like this, and here's a quote: American Declaration of Independence speaks of the inalienable right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Recently, following the pioneering work of Martin Seligman, who was the founder of positive psychology, there's hundreds of books on happiness. And indeed, we see it's a bestseller. It's so popular these days, this topic, this theme of happiness. Yet, there is something more fundamental still to the sense of a life well lived, says Rav Sachs. And what it is, it's meaning. While the two seem similar, it's easy to suppose that people who find meaning are happy, and people who are happy have found meaning. But he wants to argue that it's not necessarily the case. The two are not the same, nor do they always overlap. And he makes a very important distinction between the two, between happiness and search for meaning. Happiness, he says, is largely a matter of satisfying needs and wants. Meaning, by contrast, is about a sense of purpose in life, especially by making positive contributions to the lives of others. Happiness is largely about how you feel in the present. Meaning is about how you judge your life as a whole, past, present, and future. Happiness is associated with taking, meaning with giving. So he actually wants to give almost very different definitions of the two, almost colliding. One is the taking, the other one is giving. Individuals who suffer stress, worry, or anxiety, we're not going to call these people happy. They are not happy, but they may be living lives rich with meaning. Past misfortunes reduce present happiness, but people often connect such moments with the discovery of meaning. I'm just thinking about what's happening right now as we are giving this presentation, as we are studying Torah here online. Some of those nurses and doctors around the world are struggling and saving someone's lives. They're having a very difficult time right now, but they certainly know that they're doing something extremely meaningful. I have no doubt about it. So what is so special about the search for meaning? And, well, he says again, Rabbi Sachs in his book says, that happiness is something that can be found not necessarily among humans. Animals, they also satisfied when you give them food. They feel contentment, they feel satisfaction, where their wants and needs are addressed. Similar, could be also called happiness to some extent, but meaning is something distinctly human. It's a human phenomenon. It has nothing to do with nature, it has to do with culture. And there can be happiness without meaning. As we said, a person can be happy, just enjoy himself in the moment, being in the moment, feeling all his needs are addressed. And there also can be meaning in the absence of happiness. A person can feel he's struggling, but he can still feel that he's doing something much greater than what his immediate needs are. And this can be even accomplished, this understanding that you're part of something much greater than you are, in the midst of darkness and pain. And here I'd like to quote from Viktor Frankl. I'm sure if you've been to my lectures, I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist who lived through Auschwitz. He lived through the nightmare of Auschwitz, and right there, as he was imprisoned in Auschwitz, he came up with writing his amazing book, his amazing contribution to humanity, Man in Search for Meaning. And he discovered something that would become eventually a new stream, a new understanding of human psychology based on search for meaning, and he would call it logotherapy. So Frankl used to say like this, how do you find meaning? People would ask him very often. So he would say, the way to find meaning is not by asking yourself, what do you want from life? Instead, you should ask the opposite. What does life want from us? Everyone in the world is unique. Judaism is telling us that every single human being is unique. One of the ideas of man being created, Adam being created in singular, there's only one person being created, and we're all descendants of Adam, is that each and every human being is absolutely unique. That's what Mishnah and Sanhedrin, that's what Judaism at large is teaching us. We all have our very unique set of gifts, abilities, that is not going to be repeated anywhere else in the planet Earth. And we all have, naturally, very unique circumstances of life. for each of us, then we have this task. We have to unlock this very difficult riddle. What is the meaning of my life? So, if we follow Frankel here, maybe the right approach is to see what is the task that we are being given. If we are here for a reason, Judaism calls us tikkun, some sort of mending, some sort of repair that we can cause in the world, each of us can do on some level, and only we can perform that particular task, that particular segment of the one global tikkun. We, each of us, has his own unique one, has a unique role in this global picture. We are here to figure it out. We are given life basically to figure it out. So this is a big calling. This is a big calling to understand what is our task in life and to address it adequately to what life, what universe, what God wants from us. And here's a quote from Frankel. Life is a task. And he would add the following. He would say, he grew up in a traditional home. He was not necessarily a religiously observant, but he certainly came to his understanding from the Jewish sources, from the observation of what Jewish life is about. And so he would say the following. He would say, a religious man differs from the apparently irreligious man only by experiencing his existence, not simply as a task, but as a mission. He or she is aware of being summoned, called by a source. For thousands of years, that source has been called God. That's what Frankel writes in one of his books. So now you can ask me a question. I announced the topic, book of Vayikra, and I'm talking about happiness, I'm talking about meaning. What's the meaning of all of this? How is it connected to the book Vayikra? How is it connected to the book we just opening this week? And, well, there's quite a few answers to this question. The first one comes with a name. Vayikra in Hebrew means literally, which is the first word of the book, and he called. That's what Vayikra means. And, well, the whole book has been called after the first name. And of course the question is, what's the relevance? What's the relevance of this and he called? If you actually take a look at the first sentence in the Sefer Vayikra, how it starts, you'll be surprised to see that the word itself is not even needed. It's really redundant. I'm opening the text here, and Vayikra el Moshe v'yidaber Adonai elav me'oel moed limor. He called to Moshe, and he, that's God of course, spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, and here comes the commandment of bringing sacrifices. So it could have just been totally omitted. He called to Moshe. We can just start from Hashem spoke to Moshe from the tent of meeting, right? Nothing would have been missing in terms of the content, in terms of the actual text. So why do we have this calling? Why do we have this he called to Moshe? Here comes Rashi, one of our most important commentators. And Rashi is saying the following. He called to Moshe, says Rashi like this. Every time Hashem communicated with Moshe, whether signaled by expression and he spoke, or and he said, or and he commanded, the different expressions in the Torah given to how Hashem would communicate with him, it was always preceded by God calling to Moshe by name. And it says Rashi, calling, if you call somebody by name, we all like to hear the sound of our name. Calling is an expression of endearment. Calling is an expression of certain significance, relationship. It's more than just go and do such and such thing. There's a calling that precedes the actual context, the actual tochen, the actual doing part. Before we get to business, we're having the relationship. We're having this very unique connection between the two of them, between God and Moshe. So calling is an expression of endearment. It's the expression employed by the angels, and he gives us a quote from Isaiah. So basically what Rashi is saying, Rashi is saying here that Vayikra, the word itself, is a very significant word. It implies a relationship. It implies being called up to a task. Being called up to a task with love. Because there's a relationship of love, of bonding, of mutual commitment. So Rav Sachs says this is the source of one of the key ideas of, not only in Judaism, but of Western thought, the concept of vocation or a calling. That is the choice of a career or way of life, not just because you want to do it, not just because it's something that appeals to you personally, but because it offers certain, or not necessarily because it offers certain benefits, but because you feel summoned. You feel literally summoned to. You feel that this is something that's much greater than your personal needs and wants. This is a calling. This is something that is going to give your life sense of direction and purpose. This is the way to fulfill your mission in life. This is potentially what you've been placed on earth to do. So that's the name of the book Vayikra, and the book, of course, is dealing with sacrifices. So there must be some sort of a connection between the name and the book. The main theme of the book being sacrifices. And before we get to that, I want to point out, this idea again is taken from Rabbi Sachs, that calling is one of the very major themes in Tanakh. We find callings, all the great Jews, all the great leaders mentioned not only in the Torah, but in all the books of the Tanakh, are being called to come up to where they're supposed to be and to address the calling, to address that voice coming from God, and to step up to the realization of their mission in life. We find it, of course, with Abraham, Lech Lecha. It's a famous beginning of Judaism. It starts with Abraham, the first Jew, and he's been called up on a journey, which is the journey of his life. Lech Lecha. We can think of he's leaving his family, he's leaving his land, he's leaving the idolatrous culture of the world. He's the pioneer. The new beginning starts with a calling. We can think of Moshe, who encounters God for the first time in a burning bush in Sneh, and there is a calling there too. We can think of a beautiful line in Isaiah. Isaiah, one of our greatest prophets. Isaiah has this beautiful vision, a prophetic vision, a mystical vision of Hashem surrounded by the angels. He's enthroned in that throne of glory, and the angels are around him. And Isaiah says, Yeshayahu says, "Then I heard the voice of Hashem saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "And I said, here am I, Hineni, send me." One of the most interesting and most powerful callings we find in the story of Shmuel. Shmuel being one of our greatest prophets. Shmuel being the one who anointed two of our kings. Saul, the first king of Judea, the first king of Israel, and eventually King David. We have a study group of Tanakh, so we learned about it. And it's a very interesting story. It's a powerful story. You have the story in the temple in Shiloh, in the sanctuary of Shiloh, where you have Eli, who is the priest. And at this point, of course, Shmuel is a young lad. He is just a teenager, and he's an assistant to Eli. And he's there at the temple. And all of a sudden, he hears a voice that's calling him by name. He has no experience of prophecy before. He never had it. And so, he doesn't know what it is. He thinks it's probably Eli calling him, but Eli is asleep. Eli is not calling him. And it happens the second time. And Eli tells him, "No, I never called you." And a third time. And a third time Eli, who is of course having all his life been serving in the temple of God, he has experience. He understands what's happening. He understands actually that this little boy is having a prophetic experience. God is talking to him. He's not talking to Eli at this point. He's talking to this boy. And he's telling him, you know what, next time it happens, God is calling you by name. You should say, here am I, Lord. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. I'm listening. And, well, it couldn't occur to young Shmuel at this point, he was still a child, that God is actually summoning him up to a mission. But that's exactly what was happening. And eventually you will become the greatest of our prophets, almost on the same level as Moshe Rabbeinu. So this idea of calling, of course, the idea of Vayikra, the idea of calling, is one of the central ideas in Judaism. And we see many examples of that in the Tanakh. And now I want to go to make this connection between the name of the book, Vayikra, which is the calling, and the central theme of the book, the sacrifices. Of course, we have very little understanding of the importance of sacrifices after we don't have the temple for 2,000 years. And after this, the very idea of sacrificing animals is not something particularly applicable today. And we can find criticism of this idea on so many different levels, including religious level, where we'll get to that later. But I'd like to start with understanding of the inner working of sacrifices, without discussing whether we're going to have sacrifices when the temple will be rebuilt or not. You're probably familiar with a famous idea of Maimonides of Rambam, who much to a very strong dislike of the other rabbis said that in the third temple there will be no sacrifices of animals, because basically the idea of animal sacrifice, which was practiced by all the nations of the world back then during the time of the temple, was an idea that we kind of grew out of, and we can serve God in a different way without having to sacrifice physical animals. But the symbolism, the understanding of the inner workings of sacrifices, the understanding of what's behind the concept of sacrifice from Jewish perspective, not from pagan and idolatrous perspective, but from Jewish perspective, is very, very relevant to us today. And so we find Jewish thinkers, especially those who are into Kabbalah, those who are into mysticism, trying to address this from the inner perspective, trying to understand what's the inner significance of sacrifices. And so here comes the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, an unlikely quote from me, right? Shner Zalman of Ladi. Shner Zalman of Ladi addressed this point on many levels, and he speaks about the essence of korbanot, the essence of sacrifices. What do we sacrifice, he's asking. What do we sacrifice when we bring the korban? We essentially sacrifice, we offer ourselves. We offer ourselves. We bring to God our faculties, our energies, our emotions. We bring to God our thoughts, our ideas. The physical form of it, which was back in the day was an animal offered on the altar, is just an external act. It's an external manifestation of this inner act. For what is the inner act? The inner act is the real sacrifice, is the act of giving something of ourselves to God. And surprisingly enough, or maybe not surprisingly, he's actually deriving this straight from the way God is commanding Moshe, right in the very first sentence, right in the beginning of the book of Vayikra. He called Vayikra and Moshe, he called to Moshe and spoke to him from the tent of the meeting, saying, what is Hashem saying? Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man among you brings an offering, sacrifice, right, to Hashem, from animals, from the cattle, or from the flock, shall you bring your offering. We'll get back to this one single line, and we see how many things we can learn from just one sentence to understand the concept. Because very often we look into one idea in the Torah, connecting it with the words, with the text, and understanding the text. Each and every word in this particular sentence is relevant. And we're going to see how it is relevant. It's relevant to understand this inner act of sacrifice and what is the concept of sacrifice. So here it says, Adam mikem. Adam ki yikriv mikem. a man or a person among you. A person among you. So the sacrifice is mikem, says Shneur Zalman of Vladik. Sacrifice is from you, of you. This is something that you give of you. That's the essence, and that's the main idea of the sacrifice. Now, what are the main aspects? How you do this? We're going to look into the sentence again, and we're going to see there's three things being described. We have behema. Behema is animal. Bakar, cattle. Tzon, flock. So these three words are important. You can bring your sacrifice from animals, either cattle or flock. You shall bring your offering. This seems to be just technical description of how it's been done. And yet, each of these words, if understood symbolically, actually is telling us something about the nature of what's happening in the sacrificial service. So, if you look at a human being from a spiritual perspective, from kind of a little bit more mystical perspective, what we have here, we have a human nature being in constant conflict between what they call in the mystical world behema, the physical, materialistic, animalistic aspect, and the spiritual aspect, the ruach, the neshama, the soul. So these are two aspects of what human being is. And what are we called to sacrifice? We call to sacrifice our materialistic aspect, of course, the animal part, right? In what sense and how? Let's see how it works in detail. A hint is given basically in the pasuk, in the verse itself. We have in three words that we have behema, which means just animal in general. We have bakar, which is cattle. And we have tzon. Tzon is referring to flock. And each represents a particular aspect, a particular separate animal-like feature that we are called to bring to Hashem. First one is behema. Behema is, the Hebrew word behema actually means domesticated animal. It's not just any animal, it's not a wild animal. Wild animal would be called chaya. Here we're talking about domesticated animal. So, this is sacrificing the animal instinct itself. This is about the animal instinct. So, animals follow the nature, they follow the instinct they have. They spend time searching for food. Their lives are basically struggle to survive, right? That's all there is, a struggle to survive. We should go beyond it. We should sacrifice the animal within us to be moved by things that are beyond the mere struggle for survival. We can think of moments like that right now when we are all being challenged by the situation, right? All of a sudden you see very awkward scenes, and I saw some on YouTube video. A very intelligent lady is literally battling with somebody in a supermarket over, you'll be surprised, the toilet paper. We can find ourselves in situations like that because when we are being challenged, all of a sudden we become more like animals. We feel the need to protect our base, and we basically turn into just survival mode, right? So I think the struggle of life, to a large extent from Jewish perspective, from spiritual perspective, is to go beyond the survival mode. To remember that we are not just this instinct of survival, we are something much more than that. So that's the first aspect. Wittgenstein, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Wittgenstein, when he was asked, what's the task of philosophy, what philosophy is about? He gave a very cute answer. He said, to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. And a fly, we can imagine being in a bottle, trapped in a bottle. Fly is trying to break through. is banging its head against the glass. It's trying to break through. It's trying to find a way out. The one thing it doesn't do, the one thing it doesn't see, it fails to see, is, of course, it doesn't look up. Right? It can get out of the bottle. You just need to look up. right? You don't need to be on that level. You don't need to bang against the glass. You can look up. That's all you need to do. And that's the godly soul within us. That's the neshama. The neshama is calling us to look up. That's the force that is making us to look up, so to speak. Beyond the physical world, beyond mere survival in search of higher things, meaning, purpose, goal. Second aspect is bakar. We have the word bakar for kettle. And the Hebrew word bakar has the same root as boker. Boker, as you probably know, means morning. We say boker tov, right? In Hebrew, that's good morning. So bakar, kettle, surprisingly enough, is referring to morning. But also boker, the word boker itself has to do with dawn, right? That's why the morning. Dawn, right? When the dawn breaks, that's the morning time. So the idea is to break through. The idea is to break through. As the first rays of light, they're breaking through the darkness. They're making their way through the darkness of the night. And so cattle would naturally break through the barriers unless you put it into some constrained area, into, you're surrounded by fences. They're not going to respect boundaries. They're not going to. So, to sacrifice the bakar, to sacrifice this aspect would mean to learn, recognize, and respect boundaries. To learn how we do that. What are the boundaries? And Judaism is all, halacha is all about boundaries. What is holy and what is profane? What is kodesh and what is holy? What is mundane and what is specifically designated to be kodesh, to be holy? What is kosher and what is not kosher? So we have plenty of different boundaries, and by having these boundaries we recognize the limits of the physical, and we can actually go beyond limitations in spiritual by imposing some limitations on the physical, allowing the spirit to manifest itself. These barriers are barriers of mind, right? Nobody's watching us. Nobody's staying there with a stick saying, don't eat treif, eat kosher, right? Oh, observe Shabbat. We don't have that type of society, thank God. Thank God. And it was actually never meant to be. The biggest nightmare of some secularists in Tel Aviv is that one day the rabbis will come after us and they're going to come with the sticks. They're gonna force us into Shabbat observance. Well, that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen because Judaism is not working like that. It cannot work like that. The idea is, of course, that these boundaries, all the religious boundaries are self-imposed. The boundaries are here for us to be recognized and to grow spiritually with the context of those physical boundaries that we have. So that's the idea of bakar. And finally, we have the idea of tzon. What is tzon? The flock. That represents herd instinct. The flock, they're all the shepselach, the sheep, they all like one big body, they all stick to each other. That's the herd mentality. That's what we call herd mentality. So, all the greatest figures of Judaism, they seem to go in the opposite direction. You're thinking of Abraham Avinu. Abraham Avinu is the person who's the pioneer. The whole world, why is it called Ivri? Why is it called Hebrew? The whole world is Me'ever Ha'echad from one side of the river, and Abram is Me'ever Sheni from the other side. So he goes against this herd mentality. He's the one to start a new way. We see the spirit of Judaism. We see the spirit of being a pioneer throughout history. We see it all the time. We see it even in secular context. We see all these Nobel Prize winners. We see all these great scientists and all these people that become pioneers in so many areas of life. That's the Jewish DNA. That's us being descendants of Abraham. We want to be the ones to start a new thing in each and every area. Of course, the idea is a spiritual one. So, also the word kadosh. The word kadosh in Hebrew is setting something apart. The literal meaning of kadosh is being separated, setting something apart, making it different, making it special, making it distinctive. So, Rav Sachs says, Jews were the only minority in history consistently to refuse to assimilate to the dominant culture or convert to the dominant faith. They could only come from this understanding of Kadosh, from this understanding that we have our own boundary, we have our own place on planet Earth, we have something, our own sense of mission, something that's important, something that cannot be compromised, something that needs to continue. Finally, Korban. What is Korban? The idea of Korban, which is sacrifice, and Leakriv, which is to bring or to offer something as a sacrifice. It actually means, literally, it's from the word karov, bringing something close. The act of bringing something close. So the key element is not so much giving something up, like you find in idolatrous cultures. You have all these powerful gods that are ruling the world. And I'm, a little speck in the universe, I'm a little microbe, and these gods can do whatever they want with me, so I need to appease them. I need to give them something of myself. I need to sacrifice something to them. Sometimes I actually hate those gods. I hate them to the guts, but what can I do? They are so powerful. They are so powerful, so I need to sacrifice my firstborn son. And that's how you find this terrible acts of human sacrifices and nothing close. It's about relationship. You're going to have a relationship with your idolatrous gods that is just very, very powerful, almost like gang leaders. There's no relationship based on love. The maximum you can have is fear. But here we're talking about a relationship which is based on love. So the act of sacrifice in Judaism is the act of bringing yourself closer to God. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the criticism of the idea of sacrifice. We live at a time where it's hard for us to understand what sacrifices were, and certainly the idea of bringing animal as a sacrifice today is very, very foreign and alien to us. But we'd be surprised maybe to see that during the time of the first temple, when this was practiced very widely, we had prophets who were the leaders sent to us by God. They were speaking the word of God, and they were the ones very often to object, to raise their voice against korbanot, against sacrifices. We're not talking about human sacrifices. We're not talking about raising their voice against sacrifices to foreign gods. We're talking about them not being happy with how people fulfill what God is telling them to do. God is telling them to bring sacrifices. That's this book, Vayikra, is talking about, right? We have so many laws of sacrifices. And people were doing just that. They were doing it perfectly well, it seems. And yet prophets were so much against it. And we're going to see not just one prophet saying things against sacrifices. We're going to see quite a bunch of them. And I'll give you a few quotes. Amos who lived in the south, and lived in Judea. He said in the name of God, "If you offer me burnt offerings or your meal offerings, I will not accept them," says Amos. He says it in the name of God. "I will pay no heed to your gifts of fatlings, but let justice well up like water, righteousness like an ever." He seems to confront the two ideas. What you're doing is you're doing some sort of a lip service to me, says Amos. Bringing all these technical sacrifices. Whatever God really wants from you, though, He wants kirva. He wants closeness. He wants relationship. He wants not just you bringing the sacrifice and saying, "God, here we go. You wanted me to bring you something. Here it is. Take it. Take it and leave me alone." Where God wants the exact opposite of it. God wants the connection. He wants the relationship. So here comes another prophet. Here comes Jeremiah. Jeremiah who saw the destruction of the temple. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, is actually suggesting, if you really look into what he says, that sacrificial order was potentially not even God's initial intention. "For when I freed your fathers from the land of Egypt," says Yirmiyahu, "I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offerings or sacrifice. But this is what I commanded them. Do my bidding, that I may be your God and you may be my people. Walk only in the way that I enjoin upon you, that it may go well with you." So the idea is, sacrifices may be the way that was accepted throughout the whole world. And so Judaism kind of allows the animal sacrifices. But people were taken by the technicalities of it and not necessarily paying attention to the meaning of kirva, to the idea of closeness. They were not necessarily seeing this as an important thing. And we even find similar critique in the several Tehillim, in the several Psalms. "Were I hungry, I would not tell you, for mine is the world, in all it holds. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? God is asking in the book of Psalms. Lord, open my lips and let my mouth declare your praise. Elsewhere in the Psalms, Psalm 51 now. You do not want me to bring sacrifices. You do not desire burnt offerings. True sacrifice to God is a contrite spirit. God, you will not despise a crushed heart. Again, the same idea. We have the inner action, which is more important than the external act of sacrifice that very often comes at expense of the inner kirva, of inner closeness. And strongest of all, of course, is the passage in Yeshayahu, in the book of Isaiah. Over there, we read this passage actually on Shabbat Chazon. We read it before Tisha B'Av, before the morning of the destruction of the temple. So what does it say there? What need have I of all your sacrifices, says Hashem? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams and of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you? Who has asked this of you? This trampling of my courts. Wow. Wow. What do you mean? God. We're doing exactly what He wants us to do. We're bringing 1, 2, 3, 4 exactly according to the right order, like it's been specified, and we have the whole book of Torah. This book, we're studying now, dedicated to this idea of a sacrifice. And yet you're telling us this is not important, and not only not important, He's saying, Mi bikesh mikem remos chatzerai. God is saying, according to one of our greatest prophets, according to Isaiah, Mi bikesh mikem remos chatzerai. Who asked you of this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. And wow, this is very, very strong critique. We know prophets were an inspiration for many different groups of Jews. It's not a surprise they were an inspiration for revolutionaries, because there is a spirit of some sort of almost like a rebel spirit in the words of the prophets. They almost like a counterculture to this existing order of things. They want to shatter that order. They want to really show you the hypocrisy of what's happening. The lie where on surface these people are so nice, they are so neat, they are so close to God, but essentially they don't seek that closeness with God. They only want to pay off and get rid of any connection with God by paying Him off, by giving Him those almost like bribes, by giving Him this service, which is really the very external service that's not taking into account any idea and understanding of what God really wants of us. So of course, prophets were angry not with the institution of sacrifices. Prophets were not talking against what God suggested should be done. Prophets were talking and criticizing something very, very real. Something very real then and something very real now. We're talking about hypocrisy. We're talking about where people serve God. And unfortunately we have this problem today, right? Every time in history we have this problem of hypocrisy, where people act externally as they're very, very close to God. They pretend to be the servants of God, and yet the other actions, the actions towards fellow humans, towards fellow Jews, are acts of cruelty, are acts of injustice, are acts of insensitivity, are acts of total disrespect and disregard to the society and the people around them. So what's the value of such sacrificial service? What's the value? You're not seeking any kirva, you're not seeking any closeness. Or potentially, and that is a mistake that many people would make, you look at it as almost as two domains. There's a domain of God, and there's a domain of humans. The one is a religious one. If you want to be a religious person, you serve God, you work on your relationship with you and God. So you do prayer, you do Torah study, you do all these things, but you disregard the other aspect, which is not less important, the aspect of your connection with other humans, with your fellow Jews, with your fellow humans. So after looking at this critique from the prophets, what would be the right approach? Rav Sachs has another great line here, and Rav Sachs says like this. Rav Sachs says that specifically in his book, in Vayikra, you have the greatest examples, the twin commandments of love your neighbor as yourself and love the stranger. The first one, love your neighbor as yourself, v'ahavta lecha kamocha, is the golden standard of Torah. It's the klal gadol b'Torah. It's something that is considered to be, by Rabbi Akiva and many our sages, the most important idea in the Torah. The second one, love your stranger, love the stranger, right? V'ahavta et hager is being repeated in the Torah 36 times, if I'm not mistaken. You can check how many, but certainly more than 30. So this is a remarkable thing. The idea that you love somebody who's not like you. The idea that you love somebody who's coming from a very foreign background, is coming, and it's a natural thing for us not to like those who are not like us. But Torah specifically insists on us working on our character traits and loving each other and loving those that came to us, even though they're very different from who we are. They're coming from a different culture. They're coming from a different society. And that is in the context of sacrifices. That is in the book of Vayikra. So, the sacrifices should really express our love and connection. We understand that these two things, my relationship with God and my relationship with the humans, with the society around me, with the people around me, they are one and the same. So, what Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and other prophets, that many of them who spoke against sacrifices, Micha, Hosea, they all witnessed societies in which people were very meticulous. They were very, very punctual and meticulous about the sacrificial order, about the service in the temple. Because they were motivated by fear that God will punish them. They were not necessarily motivated by the desire to seek connection with God. And that's what caused the anger of the prophets. Also seeing that this very same people that come to the temple and bring the sacrifices, they are involved in corruption, in bribery, in perversion of justice, in abuse of power, in all those terrible maladies of society that were present back then, and they are still present today, as we know. In religious circles, unfortunately, would not be an exception to this rule. It's everywhere, and it's very pervasive, as we know, because humans are just humans. So, the danger of the system, according to the prophets, according to the Nevi'im, the danger of the sacrificial order, the danger of the system is that it can lead people to think there's like two separate domains. There's my obligation to God as the temple, and I can be a good Jew by just behaving well to God and being, bringing all the sacrifices, and that apparently somehow will be enough. Forgetting about my other very important obligation towards my fellow humans. And being totally disconnected from them and just being focused on my personal needs. And Judaism rejects this concept of two domains. Judaism tells us that even though halachically they may be distinct, but psychologically and spiritually, these two are basically, essentially, they are one. They are a single system. And Rasak says, to serve God essentially is to serve humanity. And that's the point that is made by one of our last prophets, Micha. Micha says something very beautiful. He says, He has told you, O men, what is good, and what Hashem requires of you. To do justice, to love goodness, and to walk humbly with Hashem. So what is this hatzneh lechet? What is this walking humbly with Hashem? I think that's exactly what we've been talking about. Addressing your calling from a point of something that is higher than your personal needs and wants. That's hatzneh lechet. And Yirmiyahu was speaking of one of the last kings of Israel, King Josiah, and he spoke about him. He judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well with him. Was not this to know me, says Hashem? In other words, to know God is not just to know God intellectually, which many philosophers, including Rambam, understood that the most important part of it, of course, to come close to God intellectually and spiritually, but in the world of the prophets, in the world of the mystics as well, it's not just an intellectual perception, it's the action of the heart, it's the movement of the heart, it's that understanding that we are ultimately very close with God. We are connected with God, and by being involved and engaged in that God's plan and seeing yourself as being part of that plan, we act from that place towards God and towards people around us. And that's essentially what Rambam Maimonides is saying in a famous passage at the very end of his Guide for Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim. He quotes from Yirmiyahu, and the quote is like this: only in this should one glory, only in this should one glory, that they have the understanding to know me, that I am Hashem, who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth, for in these I delight, says Hashem. In other words, and Rambam concludes, to know God is to know what it is to act, and how it is to act with kindness, justice, and righteousness. And to conclude and wrap it up, I'd like to say the following. And we're going to connect from where we started, the happiness and meaning in life, to where we were finishing the korbanot, the sacrifices, the book of Vayikra, the meaning of the calling, and the meaning of the way the book is called Vayikra, which means the calling. Each of us has a calling, and as we quoted from Viktor Frankl, maybe the right way to approach what's our meaning in life is not from the perspective of what I want to do, but rather what life wants me to do, what God wants me to do. And so here we can think of each of us is absolutely unique. Each of us has unique set of characteristics. Even identical twins are different, as we know. Not only biologically different, but spiritually different. They're two distinct human beings. So, which means basically each of us can do something absolutely unique on the planet Earth. So there's something only we can do, and nobody else can. And in this time, in this place, and these circumstances where we're being here and now, we can ask ourselves the question, what is it? For each of us, Hashem has a task. For each of us, there's a work to perform, a kindness to show, a gift to give, a love to share, a pain to heal. We have so many beautiful things we can do. And Vayikra is the calling, not just to Moshe, but potentially it's the calling to each and every one of us to give it a little bit of thought, especially in times like now when we have more time for this. Maybe specifically the idea of these difficult times is for us to, where we get disconnected from all the outside noise, where we get disconnected from all the minutiae of life. We have this very unnatural kind of existence almost in the shell, in isolation. We can hear finally, Kol Dmama Daka, the tiny voice of God, which is calling us to discover this meaning, to discover this calling. And how do we know what it is? Trust me, it's not me trying to answer the question. I don't think I know the answer, but Rav Sachs says something very beautiful. Rav Sachs says the following. Some years ago, he says, I wrote a book to heal a fractured world. And I offered this as a guide, and it still seems to me to make sense. So what's the guide? How do we find our purpose in life? How do we know what this is? Where what we want to do meets what needs to be done. What we want to do meets what needs to be done. And I think it's a very good description. That is where God wants us to be. He wants us to be at a place that we naturally can be good at, because that's something we want to do, and that want, the ratzon, is being instilled essentially by God, and it's addressing something very, very important in us, in our essence, but that's also coming from a place of understanding and recognizing that this is a need, not just my individual personal need, but this is a need that is there in the world, that is yearning to be revealed. And this need is going to be revealed by you, by me, by us. And with that, I'd like to conclude. And I'd like to send you a virtual hug to all of you present here. And we will be open to questions. We have in this on Zoom. I will try to answer some of your questions here on Facebook as well, if you send it to me in a chat. But I'm closing this Facebook here at the moment and saying thank you very much, those who watched us on Facebook. Bye.